pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. I'm torn between reading his longer set of credentials or his shorter. Our next speaker is sufficiently distinguished to have a resume which is as long and as interesting as some of his books. The short one doesn't do him justice, but I'd rather leave him more time to speak, so I will just tell you that Professor Cantor is Professor of History, Sociology, and Comparative Literature at New York University. And I would ask you to, I'm going to read that again. I would ask you to reflect on someone who is a professor of history, sociology, and comparative literature. The word polymath comes to mind. This is a man of outstanding intellect, a prolific and prestigious writer, insightful and provocative, social critic, medieval maven, and someone who has, in terms of our institute, generously given of his time, starting 2 years ago with our first colloquium 95, and in the interim to teach our students, for which we are very grateful. And it is with great pleasure that I bring to your attention now Professor Norman Cantor. There'll be a timeout for technological manipulation. This should go in your pocket. Thank you, Mr.
Don't walk on me with my nose. Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me? I don't think it's loud enough.
Well,
Sure?
worst case you could.
If anybody can't hear me, you raise your hands, okay? Well, someone told they couldn't hear me. Can you make this louder? Okay? Okay. Some people have remarked to me that they were surprised I didn't speak all day yesterday. They may have forgotten that I have written a book called The Sacred Chain about reclaiming Jewish history from mythology and from poetic truth. I was very busy yesterday and this morning taking notes on what this magnificent array of learned scholars had to say. And my notes, if I can ever decipher them, will be reflected in the next edition. I've been asked to speak about the medieval Jew. I spent the greater part of my career writing books about medieval Catholics.
Close enough.
And I welcome the opportunity to speak about the other side, you might say. I am discussing the period between 500 and 1500 AD, a very long millennium, the long Middle Ages, and I am talking mainly about Western Europe. Let us say from Warsaw west to Dublin. Let's say from Oslo south to Palermo, Sicily. Of course, there is another Middle Ages. There is the Arabic Muslim Middle Ages. and I will touch on that. But I am dealing mainly with Western Europe, which I know. I think I know. Round about the year 500 AD, a terrible disaster struck Western Europe. It's equivalent to an atomic bomb going off. Think of those movies with Mel Gibson or Kevin Costner, in which after the bomb has dropped, people are wandering around in the midst of plague and confusion and death everywhere and depravity. That was somewhat of the effect of the great invasions of the Roman Empire that occurred in the 4th and 5th centuries. Western Europe, which had been under the safe and secure rule of the Roman Empire for half a millennium, was invaded by two groups of people who overwhelmed the defenses and established new kingdoms, replacing the benign and the beautiful Roman Empire. These were people called Germani, Germans, who were originally from Scandinavia. They were actually Scandinavians. But when they invaded the Roman Empire, they had been given a new name called Germans, which has stuck. And I do recall, even in the 20th century, that name has symbolized violence and depravity at times. And the other invaders were Mongolians, who were called Huns. They brought down the Roman Empire. And painfully over the next 3 centuries, after 500 AD, the successor kingdoms, the barbarian successor kingdoms were established. Was this bad for the Jews? I knew that's in your mind. No, it was good for the Jews. The Jews had actually benefited from the first 300 years of the Roman Empire when it was ruled by pagans. In spite of what went on in Judea in the 1st century AD and early 2nd century, the Jews who lived in the great Roman diaspora, which was 90% of the population of the Jewish world, at least 80%, they lived a good life. They were very comfortable under Roman rule. But after the year 312 AD, the Roman Empire became Christian. And by the end of the 4th century, by 400 AD, the Roman government, now in alliance with the Christian church, which had been a great competitor with the Jews in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, the church demanded that the emperor eliminate their competition, their Jewish competition, and impose what was effective ghettoization upon the Jews. And this was incorporated into Roman law. Jewish synagogues could not be built, said the Theodosian Code of Roman law of the year 425. Jewish synagogues could not be built without the permission of bishops. Jews had to wear a yellow star or a funny hat. They had to wear distinctive clothing. Where have we heard that? Jews could not employ Christian workers. Jews could not intermarry with Christians. Jews were segregated. The word ghetto comes from Venice around the year 1520, but in effect the Jews were ghettoized in the later Roman Empire when it passed under Christian rule. So if the Roman Empire collapsed, good for the Jews. It took away these terrible stringencies upon the Jews enforced by the later Roman Christian Empire. The Jews did very well in Western Europe between 500 and about the year 1000. This is the half a millennium of the rise of Ashkenaz, of the rise of the Jews of Western and Central Europe outside of Sepharad, outside of Spain, outside of Iberia. The Jews became known as Ashkenazi. And I would guess that 95%, or at least 90% of the people in this room are descended directly from the Jews of Ashkenaz, the Jews of Western Europe between 500 and 1000 AD, outside of Iberia. The Jews were the large-scale merchants and bankers of Germanic Europe, of barbarian Europe of the early Middle Ages. They had the capital, they had the commercial capability, they had the courage to engage in long-distance trade. And they also had kinsmen, landsmen, and just fellow members of the Jewish faith on the shores of the Mediterranean with whom they could engage in handel, with engage in trade. They were the great merchants of the early Middle Ages. They brought into Western Europe from the Mediterranean and beyond, from as far away as India, the jewels, the spices, the perfumes that the nobility, the aristocracy of the early Middle Ages wanted to make their crude lives a little more comfortable and beautiful. And what did the Jewish merchants take from Europe down into the Mediterranean? What did they take on the return journey? They took furs. They took swords. They took lumber. Those great 19th century Jewish lumber merchants in Eastern Europe, they had predecessors who were doing that kind of work, carrying lumber down from northern Europe into the Mediterranean, from the great forests of Germanic Europe into the Mediterranean. They were doing that in the year 800. And, I regret a bit to say, they took slaves. The Jews were very much involved in white slave traffic from the Germanic world into the Mediterranean in the early Middle Ages. This has been thoroughly documented, although you won't find it in many Jewish history textbooks. And the Jews provided the credit instruments that this society, this crude agricultural rural society, needed. Often when a great lord died, his family needed a bridge loan so they could settle the estate and pay the inheritance taxes. And they resorted to a Jewish banker to provide them with this kind of money. When kings went to war, which was about every 3 months, they would often need a loan to finance their war material, and the Jewish bankers could provide it. After around the year 750 AD, the Jewish importance in international trade accelerated with the Muslim Arab expansion. The Muslim Arabs conquered the whole eastern and southern shore of the Mediterranean and 90% of Spain in a matter of 60 years. And in some places, they had the help of Jews who thought they might do better under Muslim rule than they were doing under Christian rule. Jews, while they were generally doing well, there were places where they weren't, and they would help the Muslim Arab invaders. A very great scholar, Solomon Goitein, who began in Europe and suffered through the Hebrew University for a decade or so, and ended up at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and the University of Pennsylvania, making use of the Genitza archives of the old Cairo synagogue, which was discovered around 1900, wrote a 5-volume work called The Mediterranean Society, published in the 1970s and 80s. And this sprawling work, almost as lengthy and as confused as the Talmud, but even more fascinating, mainly devoted to the great Jewish merchants who established these lines of commercial contact across the Cold War and sometimes hot war line between Muslim and Christian world. There were Jewish family corporations around the year 1000 which were engaging in trade all the way from southern France, through Muslim Spain, through North Africa, through Egypt, and down through Africa to the west coast of India. Just think of the courage of people engaged in that trade in these little ships of the time, no bigger than a tennis court, subject to storms in the Indian Ocean, carrying their families' goods, risking everything, and 2 years would go by before they knew they had made a fortune or everything had sunk somewhere off the coast of Zanzibar. Maimonides' brother, the great Rabbi Rambam, born in Spain and then relocated in Egypt, his brother was involved in this kind of trade, and his brother went down with a ship. And it was after that that Maimonides, who made a living as a physician, took up the leadership of the Jewish community in Egypt. It's wonderful stories that Goitein was able to ferret out of this voluminous archive. And it impresses one with not only the commercial skill, but the tremendous courage of these people. And no wonder they were the great capitalists of the early medieval world. No wonder that Christian kings deferred to them and protected them against the hostility of envious bishops and Meshuggah monks. Two things happened of significance in the internal development of the Jewish community during this 500 years. One, the communities came to be dominated by a rabbinical capitalist elite. Most of the Jews in the early Middle Ages were not rich. Most of them were craftsmen, small farmers, carriers of wood and water. But the communities were dominated, as they were, Jewish communities were to continue to be dominated until the late 19th century by a narrow band of great capitalist families who intermarried with rabbinical families and who formed an aristocracy. There was a small degree of mobility. A very bright young man, excelling in his studies, even if he came from the middle class, or even very rarely from the Jewish working class, eventually could marry into a capitalist family and found a new rabbinical dynasty. That didn't happen often, but it sometimes did. So you have the formation of the famous Jewish community that of the Middle Ages, at Selo Baron, whom I knew well, had an office down from him at Columbia University for 3 years. I drank tea with him, maybe once every month. He was a wonderful man. This was the community that he described and expounded in his 17-volume, horribly boring work. The other thing that happened in the early Middle Ages was the rise of the law. The spreading eastward from the great schools of Iraq. Boy, I got my direction wrong. Spreading westward from the... I had you fooled there for a minute. Spreading westward from the great schools of Iraq towards Western Europe. Gerson Cohn, a great medieval scholar who later became the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary and who liberated the conservative movement from its hostility to women. He opened up conservative Judaism almost single-handed. He fought for 20 years to open up the conservative rabbinate to women. Had absolutely no effect whatsoever, but it was a very noble effort. Gerson Cohn said his researches showed that the law and the strict observance of the law took hold very slowly in Western Europe. But by the year 1000, in the cities of Western Europe, in the small cities, in the great valleys of Germany and France, in Italy, schools, Talmudic schools had been established, and over time, the law became the dominant way of life, imposed, I think, willy-nilly, on the Jewish masses. And we've all heard of Rashi, the halakhic commentator who lived in France, northern France, in a market town, by the way, and who in the early years of the 12th century wrote this commentary upon the Bible to help Jews understand the Bible and try and justify this halakhic code which they had come to live by. When Rashi was the dominant scholar, when he was the dominant commentator in the early years of the 12th century, Ashkenaz had passed its glorious age. Ashkenaz had begun its perilous descent. After the middle of the 11th century, two fundamental changes occurred in European life that brought about the deterioration of this wonderful situation the Jews had enjoyed in the early Middle Ages, when they were the great merchant capitalists, when they had a virtual monopoly on banking and credit for 500 years, when they shipped slaves to the slave markets of Alexandria, when they were the friends and confidants of kings and emperors. That changed rapidly after the year 1050 for two reasons. One, the rise of Christian capitalists. For a variety of complex reasons, the Jewish control over banking and commerce lapsed. And by the middle of the 12th century, the rise of European capitalism was well underway and was marked by the emergence of Gentile bankers and creditors. They provided intense competition for the Jews, and after 1200 they got the support of princes as well as bishops to put limitations on Jewish conduct of business. A second problem was the great revival of Roman law in the end of the 11th century. A law school was established in Bologna in northern Italy. It's still there. You can still go there and study Roman law. Not very useful in this country, but useful if you wanted to be a lawyer in France or Germany, which still live under the Roman law system. We live under a different system that was created in England in the 12th and 13th century. In case you're interested in this, I've just published a book on the subject. When Roman law was revived, of course it was modified, expanded, brought up to date, but all those old discriminatory statutes against the Jews, all that judicial ghettoization that had prevailed in the later Roman Empire came zooming back, was taught in the law schools, was enforced by the bureaucrats of the European monarchies of the 12th and 13th centuries, who all had law degrees. It was a disaster for the Jews, this revival of Roman law. On top of these two problems, there was even another one. On top of the emergence of Christian capitalism and the revival of Roman law ghettoization, there was the great upsurge of Christian spirituality. Yes, that Christian spirituality that is so much admired in the Catholic Church to the present day, that had such a profound impact on European literature, European art. What the art historians study, what they teach in the French and German departments, came under the influence of this great upsurge of Christian piety in 12th and 13th century Europe. Very positive things came out of this great Christian movement in spirituality. It reached far beyond liturgy and worship. It reached into the furthest reaches of the European imagination. And it also generated an intense Judophobia, an intense anti-Semitism, to use an awkward modern word. The point I have always tried to make to Gentile as well as Jewish audiences, or general as well as Jewish audiences, is that Judophobia, anti-Semitism of the Catholic Middle Ages was not so much the product of a bunch of nudniks over on the extreme, but was at the very heart of the flowering of Catholic spirituality. The greatest Christian thinkers and writers of the High Middle Ages, St. Anselm, St. Bernard, Geoffrey Chaucer, the English poet, consumed with hatred of the Jews. And that presents a very great problem to reflect on. How do you get Judophobia out of Catholicism? We're at the very heart of the most creative era of Catholicism. Anti-Semitism was generated in a very intense way. It was central to the great Catholic culture of the High Middle and Late Middle Ages. It was not extreme. It was not marginal. It was intrinsic. It was integral. Well, I said that enough. Maybe you'll listen. This presented a terrible problem. It meant that the European masses, the European middle class, and the European nobility, who had always been so protective of the Jews, so helpful, were now overcome by a mass media attack upon the Jews, which resulted in pogroms, intense ghettoization, exclusion of Jews from most of the business world that they had previously participated in with great success. It meant an intense decline in Ashkenaz, a tremendous decline in Jewish wealth, as well as in Jewish security. This is sometimes referred to in connection with the First Crusade to Jerusalem of the French aristocracy in 1095. And it is true, these crusaders were filled with hatred against Jews. They killed Jews in the cities of Germany on their way. They killed Jews when they got to Jerusalem, as well as Arabs. But even if there had not been this military movement against the Middle East by the French, which in the end, by the way, failed, although it did have some initial success, even if there had been no crusades, there would have been these pogroms, this ghettoization. The Virgin Mary cult goes up, and Jews go down. Let's put it very direct and simple terms. When you go to Chartres next summer, Chartres Cathedral, and you look at those wonderful stained glass windows fashioned around the year 1200 among the great creations of the European imagination, think that the people who paid for and executed those windows hated Jews. If you go to the Notre Dame next summer, look carefully at the sculptures in front of the cathedral. You will see the synagogue depicted with a blindfold over her face, because the Jews blindly rejected the Lord. Not good, let's face it. By the year 1300, the Jews had been expelled from England and did not come back until 1653. By 1350, the Jews had been expelled from almost all of France except for the eastern province of Alsace. And most of the great Jewish families of modern France traced their families back to Alsace, because that was the only part of France the Jews could still live in the late Middle Ages. Jews went eastward into Germany, where they picked up the German language and carried with them into Poland in the 16th century as Yiddish. Jews continued to live in Germany, but in the late Middle Ages there were terrible outbreaks of pogroms in Germany, and Jews moved eastward. Jews were blamed for the Black Death of the mid-14th century, for the bubonic plague. Doctors testified in court that the plague was due to Jews poisoning wells. You know what doctors like when they're called to testify in court. You can get them to testify to anything. Jews moved into Poland in the 16th century, carrying their Yiddish language, carrying their rabbinical elite, carrying their law with them, because Poland was a very primitive, backward, pre-capitalist society. It was like France around the year 800. The Jews were needed by the Dukes of Poland and by the Polish aristocracy to stimulate international trade, to provide credit instruments. And the Jews in Poland were given a new role. The great Polish aristocracy conquered the vast frontier territory of the Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of peasants. And they found the Jews useful as estate managers to control the peasants. I kid you not. Again, that's something that is sometimes ignored in textbooks of Jewish history. And Jews were paid for their task of ruthlessly controlling and exploiting the Ukrainian peasantry, who have not forgotten, let me tell you, by giving them the monopoly over the liquor trade, which Jews retained in eastern Poland and the Ukraine until the expansion of the Russian Empire in the end of the 18th century. Jews controlled the liquor trade. That was how they were paid for their services to the Polish aristocracy. Internally, during this period of the decline of Ashkenaz in the 12th and the 13th centuries, there was an intellectual crisis among the rabbis and among the Jewish intellectuals. Western Europe was penetrated by the revival of Aristotelian, Greek philosophy and science in the 12th and 13th centuries. And it was not always easy. It was indeed difficult to reconcile Greek philosophy and science, particularly in the Aristotelian mode, with revealed religion, with the traditions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And in all three cultures there was an intellectual crisis. How do we reconcile theistic traditions with philosophy and science? Among the Jews, Maimonides advocated an effort to reconciliate. And he published his famous Guide for the Perplexed, which he wrote in Egypt, as a way to try and show that you could be a devout Jew and still be a believer in modern science of that day. To tell the truth, I've always found the Guide for the Perplexed a totally unconvincing book. And it was unconvincing to the rabbis of southern France. They rejected the scientific movement. They rejected Maimonides' philosophical work, only keeping his biblical and Talmudic commentaries. And they moved, instead of moving towards science, they moved towards the Kabbalah. They moved towards the accentuation of the study of a Hellenistic astrological, mystical pastiche, which begins in the Jewish schools of Provence in southern France in the early 13th century. They rejected Maimonides' rationalism for an irrationalist mystical culture. A very, very important decision. Thereby, the Jews of Ashkenaz were not only being ghettoized and segregated externally in the Christian world, an element of intellectual self-segregation was going on. They were withdrawing from the rise of European philosophy and science. They were developing a distinctive irrationalist culture. Now let me turn to Sephardic Iberia, Andalusia, Granada. It's different, although maybe it ended up in the same place. Jews had been in Spain for centuries. They had come there long before the Germanic invaders. They had lived there peacefully in the Roman Empire. And they accommodated themselves well to Muslim Arabic rule. In the 19th century, the first great modern historian of the Jews, Heinrich Gretz, celebrated Jewish Iberia as the golden age of medieval Jewish history among those friendly, happy, tolerant Muslims. More recent historians, like Goitein, Norman Stillman, a very great medievalist at the University of Oklahoma, and Bernard Lewis, who taught at Princeton for a long time, have modified Gretz's enthusiasm. The Jews were always second-class citizens, at best, in Muslim countries. The Jews had to pay special taxes. It is true, like all medieval taxes, it wasn't heavy, but it was an additional tax. And Jews had a very small role in public life, in government, and in law. But they were able to build up their great commercial corporations that I talked about. And they developed a innovative and interesting culture, about which I think no one has yet written a very good book. There was a great development of Hebrew literature under the influence of Arabic models. Some of it highly erotic, both homosexual and heterosexual, again under Arab influence. They pursued the study of Greek and Arabic philosophy and medicine. The situation deteriorated in the middle of the 12th century. About 100 years later than the great turning point in the history of Ashkenaz, which had begun to collapse around 1050, the collapse became evident in Spain, in Arabic Spain, around the year 1150. New Muslim peoples from North Africa, fundamentalists, somewhat like those people today who make so much trouble for both Arabs and Jews, invaded Spain and took over many of the Arab governments. The Jews felt the cold wind of intolerance, not just second-class citizenship. They'd always had that in Muslim Spain. They felt the cold wind of bitter hostility. Meanwhile, from the north, those Christian princes, the Christian nobility who had retreated into the Pyrenees, took off their skis, put on their swords, and began to fight back against the Arabs. The great Christian process of reconquest of Spain from the Arabs had begun at the very same time as a new Muslim intolerance for Jews was occurring. So Jews moved towards the advancing Christian countries. And by the middle of the 13th century, 3/4 of Spain was back under Christian rule. In 1492, the last of the Muslim princes was overcome. Muslim principalities, Granada. But after 1400, Muslim Spain was insignificant. It was a Christian country. And in certain places, particularly in Aragon, in the northeast, the Jews did very well. And the Jews did work in Christian governments. The Christian princes used the Jews very much as treasury officials, as tax collectors. We now come to one of the great crises in Jewish history. The disappearance of the great Jewish community in Spain between around 1390 and 1500. There were probably 1 million Jews in Spain, 1 million observant Jews in Spain in the year 1390, along with probably 12 or 13 million Christians and Muslims. The Jewish population was a very substantial one. It was a highly literate one. It was wealthy. After 1492, there were no longer observant Jews in Spain, or there weren't supposed to be in any case. What happened? What happened to Sepharad? What happened to this great Jewish community? First of all, there was Christian intransigence. Beginning in the 1390s, led by those famous mad monks that I talked about, there was a demand for Jewish conversion. You can understand, with the Jewish community of such wealth and visibility and relative size, it was easy to stir up hostility and jealousy. There were occasional pogroms. There was pressure for conversion. But there was mass conversion in the 15th century for internal reasons as well. The Kabbalah had transferred into Spain, into the Jews of Spain, into the Jews of Aragon. And it was in Aragon in the 14th century that the Zohar, the codification of the Kabbalah, was executed. Put simply, the intellectual leaders of the Jewish community in Spain, the rabbinate, chose, as had happened in France in the early 13th century, to reject rationalism, to reject involvement in science, to reject involvement in learning, and instead to hold fast to a marginal, mystical, astrological culture. A consequence of this was that young people, young intellectuals, young Jews, young rabbinical students even, felt starved, deprived. They were being cut off from the great learning of the late Middle Ages, which flowered into what we call the Renaissance. The vast conversion of the Jews in 15th century Spain was due to an effort to breach the chasm, the intellectual chasm, that the rabbis had created by their overcommitment to the Kabbalah and their anti-intellectualism. Jews saw wonderful things going on in the Gentile world, in the great universities and schools of Gentile Christian Spain, and this was an impetus to conversion, a very important impetus to conversion of many of the most literate and brilliant of the Jews. Suppose in this country today, your children or yourself, if you're young, had a choice after you graduate from Bloomfield Hills High School of going to a yeshiva in Brooklyn or to Notre Dame University. What would you choose? That was the choice which presented itself to many Jewish intellectuals in 15th century Spain and which encouraged conversion. Jews immediately rose to great positions in the ecclesiastical and the church life and intellectual life of 15th century Spain. Jews became important bishops, leaders of religious orders. The famous King Ferdinand of Spain, remember Ferdinand Isabella, 1492? He himself was partly descended from Jewish convert families. The greatest scholar of early 16th century Spain, Juan Vives, the great Christian humanist, was a convert, or his family was. The great leader of early 16th century Spanish spirituality, Teresa of Avila, whose writings are very popular today in women's studies courses. She was from a Jewish convert family. And one could go on and on and on. Finally, in 1492, as everybody knows, the Spanish monarchy issued a decree: no more observant Jews. Either convert or get out. How many Jews were there still in Spain who were Jews rather than already converts and devout Catholics? Certainly not more than 200,000. And how many actually left Spain in 1492? Chaim Beinert of the Hebrew University spent decades mucking around through those dirty, rat-infested Spanish archives trying to count. He came up with 100,000 people who remained loyal to the Jewish faith and left. Mind you, didn't have far to go. They crossed the border to Portugal. No one ever tells you that. And then 10 years later, they moved to Turkey or Holland, most of them. Henry Kamen, a great British scholar and expert on early 16th century Spain, he had a go of it. He said there was only 40,000 Jews went into exile in 1492. I have a hunch that he's closer to the truth, because logistics and transportation being what is in the Middle Ages, even 100,000 people was a very hard group to move, even 100 miles away into Portugal, you know. You don't call the movers, you know. Now the Inquisition. How many rabbinical sermons have I sat through in my life? where the Inquisition is put in the same category as Hitler? Well, maybe. Make your choice. There were two Inquisitions, or papal established church courts, or monarchy established church courts in the case of Spain. There was the Papal Inquisition in France in the 13th century, and there was the Spanish Inquisition established by the monarchy in around 1500, 1485. These were church courts to deal with heresy, with religious subversives. As a matter of fact, the Papal Inquisition in early 13th century France was not supposed to go after Jews. They were after Christian heretics. But the judges of the Inquisition, who were mostly Dominican friars, and a remarkable number of them, I hate to tell you this, right? The Shanda for the Goyim. I hate to tell you that many of these Dominican inquisitor judges in early 13th century Spain were Jewish converts. They weren't supposed to go after Jews, but they did in many cases, because they suspected that the Jews were contaminating the Christians, that a source of the upsurge of heresy among the Christians in early 13th century Spain was coming from the Jews. This is a very difficult and vexed question. I hope someone will ask me about it later. I don't have time. With regard to the Spanish Inquisition, they were going after Jews, particularly Jews and Arabs, Muslims, who were secretly remaining loyal to their religion. Some Muslims as well as Jews. This is the famous attack on the Moranos. But the point is this, and here also, by the way, among the Spanish inquisitors, there was a significant number of Jewish converts. In a way, what happened in Spain in the 1490s and the first decade of the 16th century was a struggle within the Jewish community between those who went over to Christianity and resented Jews who remained loyal to their faith and those who remained loyal. But I want to tell you this, I have spent my life studying the records of the Inquisition, and in the whole history of the two Inquisitions in France and Spain between 1220 and let's say 1550, not more than 5,000 Jews could have suffered under the imprint of the Inquisition. And probably not more than 2,000 suffered capital punishment. The rest were imprisoned or lost their property. Boy, oh boy, if that's what the Holocaust was like in the 1940s, well, I didn't finish the sentence. I am not defending this. This is intolerance. This is evil. This is the enemy of freedom. But it's not Hitler. Just as on the one side, when we think of Catholicism, we have to remember at the very heart of the most beautiful and inspiring messages and culture of the Catholic faith lies medieval Judophobia. On the other side, we must not present a view of the Catholics of the Middle Ages carrying out a Holocaust. Finally, I know I've spoken over my time, but so have a lot of the other speakers. Just in a few minutes. I know you're hungry. I'm hungry. What are the lessons of history? Yesterday, Dr. Jefferson talked about the usable past. I agree. Of course, his past may not be my past, and his uses of history may not be mine, but I agree. One should draw lessons from history. First, population is destiny. when you're a small people, be very, very careful. The Jews were a small people in the Middle Ages. And therefore they were subject to changes, to shifts in economy, the political system, to the weather, for God's sakes. When you're small, you've got to keep your powder dry and be very, very careful. And don't raise your heads too high. Do not be arrogant. Do not think we're rich, we're powerful, Clinton will protect us. The world changes. And when you're small, you are vulnerable. You've got to be very, very careful. Secondly, irrationalism and rejection of learning creates problems. And I believe it has always created problems in the Jewish community. It created problems in 13th century Spain, 13th century France. It created problems in 15th century Spain. It created problems in 19th century Poland and Russia. If the rabbis commit themselves to irrationalism, if they reject science for whatever good, sophisticated, theological, or whatever reason, if they say only the mythology of the Bible, only the hardcore law of the Mishnah and Talmud is what we want, there will be repercussions. People will vote with their feet. Jews will depart. They will not sit forever in the synagogues and listen to the stories about Abraham and Sarah or whatever. They will not turn up to pore over the pages of the Talmud. Most Jews will not do that. And let that be a warning. The Jews lost millions of people, I believe, in the late Middle Ages because of their commitment to irrationalism and the Kabbalah. If they had gone the other route, the Maimonidean route, and tried to integrate Judaism and science, there was a problem there too. It's not simple. It's difficult. But they would not, I think, have lost the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of the younger generation and the most brilliant people that one can imagine, who disappeared into French culture and into Spanish culture. A great historian who's now head of the history department at Oxford, John Eliot, estimated 20 years ago that 1/3 of the nobility of 19th century Spain were descended from convert families. Just think what that loss was to Judaism, however defined, and to European culture. Finally, the Middle Ages were marked by an intense struggle, an intense war for centuries between Christians and Muslims. It began in the 8th century. It somewhat moderated around 1300. It revived in the 16th century. Muslims and Christians were still fighting huge sea battles in the Mediterranean in the 1570s, can you imagine? As they were fighting great land battles in France in the 8th century. There was a great struggle for the heart of Europe between the Christians and the Muslims, and the Christians prevailed. 3-4 years ago, a professor at Harvard, Sam Huntington, published a chilling book on what is going to be the great problem of the early 21st century. And he said it's going to be a religious struggle between revived Islam and Christianity. I put it in stronger terms than he did. He put most of the aggressiveness on the side of the Muslims. But we have an old, senile Polish pope traveling around the world. One of those days the plane will land and he won't get out. And then there will be a new papal election. And the next pope will be different. I would bet the mortgage that it will be a Latin American or an African. It sure won't be a Pole. They've gone through that phase. They've had enough. I see in the early 21st century a tremendous revival of Catholicism. And so we're going back to the Middle Ages in the early 21st century. And intransigent militant Islam of 300 or 400 million people on the one side, and a revived, reinvigorated, much more intensively missionary Catholicism on the other. Think of the significance of that for the Jews. Oy vey. Thank you.